Yeah, so as Rosie mentioned, my name is Lisi Lohre. I'm a master's student here in Rubenstein, and I'll be talking to you all today about my master's research, which is focused on developing an adaptive management framework for sustainable cashmere management in Mongolia. So to start things off, I'll just talk a little bit about where we're going. It's a pretty standard scientific talk here, but I'm going to talk about why cashmere is important, why sustainable management specifically is important, what we are doing to go through the process of informing more sustainable management, including our framework that we'll be using, and then some preliminary results from this summer. I spent the summer in Mongolia, and then next steps going forward. So to start off, it's probably important to know what cashmere is. So cashmere wool actually comes from domestic goats. It's the downy underlayer that's grown in the wintertime to provide insulation. And it has to be hand combed from the goats. So unlike sheep wool, where you can shear it off the sheep, goats have this long, coarse over fur, which actually prevents it from being able to be sheared off. So the process is very intensive. It has to be combed off, and then you get that wonderful, soft cashmere wool that can get turned into sweaters like the one I'm wearing right now. And it's actually a multi-billion-dollar industry globally. So cashmere wool is a huge commodity. It's typically been a luxury item, but more recently, brands like H&M, fast fashion brands have made it into a cheaper option. And the crazy thing about cashmere is that 90% of the world's supply actually comes from northern China and Mongolia here. And so it's a huge amount of demand in not a lot of space. And so looking at Mongolia specifically, we can look at some trends in the livestock numbers over time. This is from 1970 to 2015. It includes the 5 main types of livestock in Mongolia, as well as this line up here, which is the total livestock. And you can really see that starting in the early 1990s, democracy was actually introduced into Mongolia, which also opened Mongolia up to the free market and to market demands like those for cashmere. And since then, this brown line here, which is the line for goats, has really skyrocketed to go from about a sixth of the total livestock in Mongolia to almost half in the modern day. So definitely a lot more goats on the landscape in Mongolia, which can have some pretty major impacts both socially, economically, and for the ecosystems. Obviously, the goats increase was for a reason. They can get the most money for cashmere wool compared to other livestock products. So this is a way for people to sustain their livelihoods in Mongolia. But the impacts have been pretty significant in terms of overgrazing on the landscape. So almost 7% of Mongolia's landscape has reached a point of degradation that cannot be restored. So it's pretty intense impacts, and these are all coupled with the effects of climate change. So Mongolia is experiencing a higher than average rate of global warming, and they've had 2.2 degrees Celsius of warming already since 1970. So that's higher than the global average there. So there's a lot of different factors that are at play in the ecosystems there and on the landscape. And specifically with cashmere, it's actually the second largest contributor to GDP behind mineral extraction in Mongolia. So this is huge, not just for the rural herders that make their livelihood there, but also for industry and for the Mongolian government. And so there's a lot of people that are interested in the cashmere issue. And there's actually been a huge push for sustainable cashmere recently because people have identified that landscapes are being degraded and that something needs to be done in order to ensure that people can maintain their livelihoods and produce cashmere sweaters into the future. So this is just a smattering of some of the interested parties. It ranges from NGOs to government agencies to the fashion industry brands like Burberry. So really a lot of focus on all fronts to try to come up with some way to sustainably manage cashmere. The issue is that there isn't really a definition of what sustainable management entails, and also how you measure sustainable management. So for these brands, they want to be able to have a certification stamp that says, we know this product was sourced from sustainable cashmere. It turns out measuring that gets a lot more complicated. And so my goal for my research is really to provide an adaptive management framework, which is a structured framework to inform sustainable cashmere management. So I'll break down what that is, because it's a lot of jargon right here. But the main goal is that people would actually be able to have a structured way to show how the decisions were made around the livestock management, and then that could help potentially show that the cashmere came from a sustainable source. And so the way that I'm going about doing this is, first of all, I have to identify what components are going to be included in this framework. So what are the key social and ecological pieces that need to be considered in decisions around cashmere goat management? Then, of course, you actually have to build the framework. So putting all these elements together into a model. And then we're actually piloting the framework in the Nart Nature Reserve, which is in eastern Mongolia, over here. And the reason we're working at Nart specifically is I'm doing my research in partnership with the Denver Zoo, and they actually helped to establish the Nart Nature Reserve in the mid-1990s. They've been conducting research on wildlife in conjunction with Mongolian universities and students for over 20 years, and also community engagement. They've been hugely involved in community engagement. They have local rangers who are herders from the community. This nature reserve is a multi-use landscape, so there's actually people who are living there year-round with their livestock. So this is really a great place for us to pilot this project, because we have the data, we have the community engagement already there. So I'm not just coming in as a 2-year master's student telling people what to do. And so the first step of our process this summer, we actually got stakeholders together to identify what their top priorities were. So we had over 90 people from the government agencies, from local herding organizations, from NGOs, and they all actually voted physically on sticky notes here about where they placed their priorities for landscape management at Nart. And the top priorities that came out were really water, pasture, and then wildlife, which works well for us in terms of modeling, specifically since my advisor is a wildlife biologist. Wildlife were of key interest to us, so we actually examined 7 different species that can kind of serve as ecological indicators. We have 2 species of ungulate that really bring people to the reserve for tourism purposes, 2 carnivores that are kind of the 2 foxes that are the common carnivores there, an endangered species of marmot, cinereous vultures, which are important decomposers for the ecosystem, and the most common vertebrates, the little toad-headed agamas there at the bottom. So all of this information is now being put into an adaptive resource management framework. Ooh, looks exciting? No. This process has actually been used in wildlife contexts before, so most famously probably in the context of managing waterfowl here in the US, determining waterfowl harvests. They use an adaptive resource management process to do that. What this adaptive resource management process is I'm going to walk you from left to right. So you take the state of the system. You have a certain number of goats, certain habitat classes in Mongolia. You do monitoring to understand that system, to figure out what's going on. And then that can help inform what number of goats you might have on the landscape at any given time. As scientists, we've developed models on the wildlife, the pasture, the water, working hard on our computers, modeling. And these can all show what we predict based on our knowledge of the state that will happen to the landscape. However, there's also what actually happens to the landscape, which needs to be considered, the system state. And then with another round of monitoring, we can see how our predictions from our models compared with what actually happened in the system. And the cool thing about adaptive management then is we can not only inform a different decision based on what happened, but we can also update our models and go through a whole nother step where we say, okay, maybe this model on a certain component didn't actually perform that well. We can adjust those so that it's updating through time. And so this is really awesome because once we develop this framework, we're actually going to take it back to the communities in Mongolia next summer and run an implementation workshop and work with people to figure out how to actually put it to use on the ground. And then hopefully the framework can be expanded to help inform a sustainable cashmere certification process. And finally, it's also extra relevant right now. So this is a picture of the Mongolian president meeting with our current president. Back in August, there's a piece of legislation that was introduced earlier this year, the Mongolia Third Neighbor Trade Act, that would allow tariff-free export of Mongolian cashmere to the US. So that could be hugely influential in terms of increasing demand further on the landscapes. So this is a very exciting and relevant time to be working on this project. And finally, I'd like to thank my funders, the Gun Institute, the Rubenstein School, and the Denver Zoo for helping support my research, as well as my committee members, my advisor, Jed Murdoch, and Dr. Pablo Bose and Dr. John Erickson, and all the people at the Nart Nature Reserve and the Denver Zoo. So, yeah, thank you, and questions?
There's 1 minute for questions.
Yes.
I want to say that I noticed your pun next up.
Yes, I was hoping people would,
That's
yeah.
not my question. Your photos about halfway through of the goats and the denuded soil gave me the lilies and brought back memories of Vermont and New Zealand under sheep landscapes. And I just want to argue to you that if you don't get the water piece right, it really will not be able to address the sustainability thing. So I'm kind of curious what's in your little simple water model circle.
Totally.
It's a water quantity or water quality model, and how much you're thinking about the water dimension.
Yeah, so the Nart Nature Reserve is really interesting in that, so it's a super arid environment. It's on the border between the Gobi Desert and like the true Mongolian steppe. And all of their water comes from springs. And the springs, they had almost 24 springs in the early 90s, and it's dried up to 4 now, currently. So there's a huge issue in terms of the water table and access to water. And it seemed like we had developed those models yet. We haven't quite figured that out, but a huge portion will be, I think, how we predict those springs will be influenced into the future, and then potentially how management could affect, or like what interventions could be made to prevent those streams from being lost. Because currently, people actually literally dig out the springs in the winter so that wildlife can drink from them. And, well, livestock and wildlife, but yeah.
Awesome. We're actually out of time, so we want to...
Find me at the reception afterwards.